Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akeri-Dunwale. The headlines. Odessa residents face temporary water outage and blackout after a series of missile attacks. French foreign minister visits the town to assess Ukraine's needs. Plus, war experts divided on how effective Germany's Leopard 2 and America's Abrams tanks will be against Russian forces. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says more weapons were necessary to fight off Russian firepower. Mr. Zelensky said triumphs in the battle for Donbas were crucial in weakening the Russian army across Ukraine. More than a dozen officials have been removed this week following a series of scandals and graft allegations.
Against our cities, every Iranian drone which terrorists use are arguments for why more weapons are needed. Only weapons neutralize terrorists. I thank all our units which show the resilience that Ukraine needs, exhausting the occupier and destroying it. The more Russia loses in this battle for Donbas, the less its overall potential will be. And one more thing, unfortunately, I have to repeat it for those who fail to hear, that any travel abroad by state officials, people's deputies, representatives of local authorities, and other persons authorized to perform the functions of the state or local governments, any of their travel abroad must be in accordance with the relevant decision of the National Security and Defense Council. There will be no other trips abroad by officials or deputies during wartime.
Meanwhile, Canadian Defense Minister Anita Anand says the country will send 4 Leopard 2 battle tanks to Ukraine after Germany this week allowed other countries to re-export the German-built tank. She added that members of the Canadian Armed Forces would be deployed to train Ukrainian soldiers in the operation and maintenance of the tanks. Ms. Anand also said that Canada may donate additional tanks in the future, depending on the talks and coordination with allies.
Today, I am announcing that Canada will supply Ukraine with 4 Leopard 2 main battle tanks in the coming weeks. This donation, combined with the contributions of allies and partners, will significantly help the armed forces of Ukraine as they fight heroically to defend their nation's freedom and sovereignty. These 4 tanks are combat ready and will be deployed over the coming weeks. We will also deploy a number of Canadian Armed Forces members to train Ukrainian soldiers with the skills they need to operate this equipment, pending coordination with allies. Although I am announcing the donation of 4 tanks today, this number may grow as we coordinate donation and sustainment plans with our allies.
Meanwhile, back in Ukraine, Odessa residents queued up to fill water bottles, facing another water supply outage after missile strikes hit crucial power infrastructure facilities in the surrounding region, causing blackouts in the city. Mobile water supply centers were deployed by city officials during the temporary water outage. A mother of 5, Tatiana, who has moved to Odessa from the embattled city of Kherson, said her children were slowly starting to recover from the effects of the war since leaving their home. She said, quote, "But as the saying goes, the war takes its toll. There are still problems. We will hope that all of this will pass." She adds that psychologists will work with the children to help them recover. And French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna has arrived in Odessa, the strategic port city on Ukraine's Black Sea coast, as part of France's efforts to boost its relationship with Ukraine and discuss its needs in the coming months. Ms. Colonna was in Odessa shortly after missile strikes hit crucial power infrastructure facilities in the surrounding region, causing blackouts in the city. The visit aims to send a message to Moscow amidst Western fears that Russia, almost a year after invading Ukraine, may still want to launch an attack on the city to deprive UK of its key maritime outlet for grain products. As part of the trip, Ms. Kolona met her Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba, to discuss humanitarian and military aid. And, of course, Russia did launch a wave of missile attacks across the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, killing at least one person and injuring at least two others. According to officials, a morning rush hour assault left critical infrastructure damaged in the Black Sea region of Odessa as well. A spokesperson for Ukraine's state emergency service says a total of 11 people had been killed during the Russian strikes throughout the course of the day. The missile strikes followed a drone attack overnight and came a day after Ukraine secured pledges of modern battle tanks from Germany and the United States to beef up its forces. In the meantime, a Russian warship armed with advanced hypersonic missiles completed a drill in the Atlantic Ocean ahead of joint naval exercises with the Chinese and South African navies scheduled for next month, and that's according to the Russian Defense Ministry. The ship's commander, Igor Krokmel, said Russia's Admiral Goshkov frigate, armed with Zircon hypersonic missiles, practiced delivering a missile strike against an enemy surface target. The exercise, described by state news agency TASS as an electronic launch or virtual simulation. The test was part of a long voyage for the Admiral Goshkov frigate, launched earlier this month, when Russian state media said the warship was dispatched with hypersonic missiles. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Russia's top rabbis yesterday on the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as it emerged that Russian officials had been excluded from the main commemorative events at Auschwitz in Poland. Meeting Mr. Putin in the Kremlin alongside the president of the Federation of Jewish Communities, Alexander Baroda, Russia's chief rabbi, Brel Latzer, said he was ready to do everything to find peaceful solutions, although he stopped short of specifically referring to the ongoing military campaign in Ukraine.
We are meeting on the eve of the International Day of Remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust, heroes of the resistance, and the position of our country is well known. Of all the Jews exterminated by the Nazis, the majority were citizens of the Soviet Union, and this is our common pain. 6 million innocent people died. For us, this suffering is terrible even today. Every year, when we remember these events, we always say, never again. It is no coincidence that tomorrow is also the anniversary of the lifting of the blockade of Leningrad. This is also the time when we remember the suffering that was then. When innocent people suffer simply because someone attacks them, it is terrible. It is inexplicable and unbearable. In this regard, we keep saying that we are ready to do everything to find peaceful solutions. Because when people suffer, it is bad for everyone. Everyone suffers when people around us suffer.
And German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius says he will kick off talks with the defense industry in Germany as early as next week to speed up arms procurement and ramp up ammunition supplies. Mr. Pistorius also told journalists that he expected German tanks to be delivered to Ukraine at the end of March. He said, quote, "I think we will deliver our Leopards, the latest, maybe at the end of March. And as everything I know, this is early enough." The defense minister also pointed out that the Ukrainian forces would start with their training on the Marder vehicles in Munster by the end of January. And for the Ukrainian soldiers who will be trained on the Leopard, it will be a little later. And a leading military analyst says Western-made battle tanks will have the battlefield advantage over their Russian counterparts, adding that once they are deployed in Ukraine, it will give them an advantage in a possible offensive to reclaim territory.
Individually, I mean, Western main battle tanks, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Challenger, the Abrams, or the Leopard, you know, they have overmatch on Russian capabilities in terms of their firepower and certainly protection. They also have things like better optics, better stabilization, so they're better at firing on the move. They're also better at locating and also critically in tank warfare, getting off that first shot. So the tanks will make a real difference, but there's, you know, it's definitely an element of quality over quantity. So Ukraine will still need to decide actually how they use these tanks. You know, do they put them straight into the fight as soon as they're available, or do they integrate them into larger formations, train and rehearse at those larger formations, and spend a bit more time integrating them into the way that they fight, to then potentially use in the summer? I mean, we'll certainly see these main battle tanks used in Europe this year to probably great effect, because we also, you know, all of these tanks were designed, you know, going back into the early 80s to be used in Eastern Europe under those conditions. You know, they were not meant for the conditions of Iraq and Afghanistan where they found themselves in the last 20 years. The protection that a Western main battle tank provides means that there's a better chance of surviving a hit yourself. The issue with Russian tanks is a pretty significant design flaw, is that they don't compartmentalize their ammunition storage within the tank itself. And that's why you've seen a lot of footage of a top attack from an NLAW or a Javelin anti-tank guided weapon system hitting the top turret of a tank, which ordinarily might not destroy the tank.
While other experts are possibly divided in their opinions, let's speak to one such expert. In-house security analyst joins us, Chidi Wanu from the British capital. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
When you said, I believe it was earlier this week when we were discussing the possibility of this, or late last week, you talked about the logistics nightmare. It does appear as if that is coming home sooner than we probably assumed. And in a very interesting dimension, all of a sudden, the Ukrainians are going to receive Abrams tanks. The tanks that you talked about on that day has been extremely expensive, extremely complicated, difficult to maintain. They're going to receive 31 of those. They're going to receive 14 Challenger tanks. And then, of course, the Leopard tanks that are the center of everything. I don't know how many they're going to receive now, because different countries are pledging different numbers. So what do you make of all of this, given the fact that we had discussed this, and what, in terms of logistics, would be a nightmare for the Ukrainians?
Well, exactly as you said, it's going to be very difficult for them. But the other side of it is that the Leopards, at the bare minimum, were expected. So somebody somewhere would have already figured out, you know, at least part of the way of what they're going to do in terms of, you know, tank repair, you know, supplies, spares, training, all of that stuff. Well, the curveballs are the Abrams and the Challengers. You know, these are fairly bespoke systems. They're not as common as we discussed last time as the Leopards. So they'll have their own unique supply chain and supply issues. The Challenger in particular, because it's a British-only tank. You know, the Abrams at least is used by, you know, Egypt, Iraq, you know, a few other, the Saudis, a few other countries. But, you know, with the Challenger, it's a British-only tank. There's only one supply chain coming all the way from the UK, but it's not impossible. What's the most important thing from the Ukrainian point of view, you know, as we alluded to previously, is beggars can't be choosers. They're getting these weapons. And the Abrams and the Challengers are very good weapon systems in of themselves, but what they are is actually a statement of intent. It's telling Russia that we're in this for the long haul. Whatever happens, we're here. We're willing to risk our prestige weapons in this conflict being destroyed, being captured. You know, they're willing to risk the humiliation of having Russia capture a Challenger or an Abrams or destroy one in order to defeat the Russian forces. And that's a powerful statement of intent. So if you look at it in its totality, the main efforts are the Leopards. The Abrams and the Challengers are kind of like the nice little add-ons, and you'll see them featuring. They're also, from an information warfare point of view, they're really good, because the Russians will be focused very, very much on tracking the Abrams, tracking the Challengers, and trying to destroy one mainly for propaganda purposes, as well as for operational purposes. But it also distracts away from the main effort, which is the Leopards, which are very good systems, depending on which Leopards are being donated. But they're still very good tanks, very effective. And when Ukraine gets around to its summer or autumn offensive, which is when these weapon systems will most likely come in, they should, if used properly, will have a devastating effect. And I add that caveat, if used properly.
Now, on the other side, of course, the Russians, as we did say on that occasion as well, are not lying idle. Yesterday, I was reading up, I believe, I don't know if it was, I think it was the New York Post, that the Russians themselves are also preparing to deploy, I mean, in response to this deployment from the Americans, the British, for the Ukrainians, they're also preparing to deploy the advanced T-90 tanks, which they have kept largely away from the battle before now. They're using the more common T-72, which the Ukrainians, incidentally, also have some of, and many of the countries which were formerly in the Warsaw Pact also have quite a lot of, because these are all Soviet Union made tanks from back then. And then there is the issue of hypersonic missiles. It escaped most news media, not ours though, but it escaped most news media when the Admiral Gorshkov was, sent into the Pacific with hypersonic missiles. And from what I understand, many of these missiles can from any location be fired to Ukraine because they travel at several multiples of the speed of sound. So, I mean, help us make sense of this.
So the Russians deploying the T-90, they have exactly the same problem as the Americans or the British deploying the Challenger or the M1, in that this is their most advanced tank other than the T-14, the Armata, which, we'll talk about briefly, but the T-90 is their most advanced production tank. It's their, their biggest seller. And they have the same problem that, we have, in that if it gets taken out, it's an embarrassment, it's a humiliation. And it's already happened. Several T-90s have been destroyed. I think 1 or 2 have been captured. And also the Russians need to keep, as I've alluded to several times, they need to keep a significant amount of their forces in reserve in case a conflict with NATO actually does break out. And the T-90s will be that main weapon system that they'll need to defeat or at least contest, the battle space with NATO machines. So deploying the T-90 in numbers should give them, a reasonably good, kind of weapon system to fight with. But it still has the same problems as the T-72. They still have the same problems that they've had throughout this war, in that a lot of the kit doesn't function as it's supposed to. So it's supposed to have, an active protection system, which hasn't been seen so far. The explosive reactive armor has, we've seen some on some of the captured tanks that is not properly filled in. They can deploy the T-90, but if it's the same, if we've got the same problems as before, whereas these have been poorly maintained and being poorly used, they'll be defeated. But tank for tank, the M1 and the Challenger would defeat the T-90. I mean, the T-90 outranges it, but both Western tanks, the M1 and the Challengers, have better optics, so they can see further, they can see at night, they can see through fog, through smoke. They've got better fire control systems, so the commander can be tracking targets, the gunner can be tracking a target, and the tank will engage one target and engage another one straight after. So they're much better in that respect. Then, when we factor in those maybe conditions, it then comes down to the training of the crews. Now, we've seen there were some very good Russian tank crews, well-trained professional crews. How many of them are still left? We don't know. Ukrainian crews that will be going on these Western tanks will be experienced, and they'll be well-trained, but they'll be very quickly trained. So they'll have the problem of not only learning to operate a completely new tank, having to learn the tactics around that tank, and then being thrown straight into battle. So there's a lot of variables, but from a planning point of view, the introduction of the T-90 is less about the tank itself and more about just the number of tanks they're able to throw into the battle. From a planning point of view, I don't worry about the T-90 any more than I worry about the T-72. It's a tank that can be defeated. And in terms of the deployment of hypersonic weapons, now again we've got it's something again you just put it into the mix. The Russians will always throw out their wonder weapons, hypersonic weapons, cruise missiles, and then every 2 days they're going to nuke Paris or London. You've got to factor that one in and just put it to the side. If they want to use the fire hypersonic weapons for the Pacific or for the Atlantic, that's their prerogative. It doesn't necessarily change the game. It's still the same thing that they've been doing throughout the conflict. Firing the weapons actually gives NATO an advantage because they'll be able to analyze the data from this and try and get a better understanding of how they perform. What it does do from the grand strategic point of view is it adds another factor into, as I said, from the planning perspective. It just puts Russian assets all around the world that NATO needs to now dedicate resources to track. So now you've got the Russians exercising in South Africa. Again, it's not a big deal, but from a diplomatic and strategic point of view, it shows that Russia isn't isolated. Russia still has allies in South Africa, still has allies with China, and is still able to deploy forces and exercise with them. But for the point of the war in Ukraine, this is all, by now we know the Russian limits, and we know what they're going to throw. They'll throw a few cruise missiles. If these hypersonic missiles actually work and actually able to be fired, they will eventually fire one just to prove they can, and it doesn't necessarily change the dynamic.
What can you tell us about the effect of that? Because someone I was talking to yesterday who knows a little bit about this did point out that perhaps the Russian deployment of those hypersonic missiles is a direct response, or was a direct preparation for the American deployment of the Patriot missile defense system. Because these hypersonic missiles are so fast, the Patriot defense system has not yet been tested against hypersonic missiles, and that therefore it may be less effective.
Yeah, that's a factor, but the point is that it still doesn't change the dynamic, in that the Russians are currently using cruise missiles, not suicide drones, but armed drones, all manner, surface ballistic missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, and attacking Ukraine. None of that changes the dynamic. If they use another weapon system to do it, they're just using another weapon system to do it. Defeating the Patriot might be embarrassing, but they're not going to use. So, I don't know how to put this, but in essence, they're not going to send 20 hypersonic missiles. They'll send, 10 normal cruise missiles, maybe 10 30 ballistic missiles, and then 2 hypersonic missiles. The Patriot will take care of the rest of them, or as many of it can, and some missiles will get through. Air attacks will always get through at some point. You're not going to have 100% coverage. So it does add that frustration factor, but these are very, very expensive missiles. I don't think Russia can afford to send a barrage of 20 every day or every week. It's going to be 1 or 2. And again, it makes no difference. The missiles they're firing now are getting through. So the ones, if they fire hypersonic missiles, they'll get through as well. It's just the Ukrainians will have to absorb that damage as it goes along.
I'm happy you mentioned the issue of the cost of all of this and the ability of the Russians to maintain this. After all, they are under very, very, very hard sanctions. But then on the side of the West as well, many of the countries are also having economic challenges. So it's not exactly as if this is without cost. Someone was telling me that one of the Patriot missiles alone is $3 million. And one system can hold 16 of those missiles. So you're talking about almost $50 million in that just one system. Now, I raised that because of the general cost of all of this. I haven't gotten the exact cost of an Abrams tank, but I guess it's safe to say that it will be in the tens of millions of dollars. So if you have that, you've got the Challenger tanks, which, as you said, Britain is the sole producer, and it's quite expensive, which was why there was some hesitance in sending it. Now, the cost of all of this, how much of all of this can any of the sides continue to afford for any length of time?
Well, as a cynic, I will say there is always money for war. So I don't. That's on that side of life. We don't really need to. You don't need to over worry about it. There will always be money to find, to buy weapons and to kill each other. That's the nature of humanity. But if we look at it, from a point of view, of each of the parties, in the American perspective, what they're sending to Ukraine is a rounding error. This is what they spent to Ukraine. They've spent on Ukraine is less money than the Pentagon loses every year. Just money that disappears randomly from accounting errors, from corruption, from theft, from carelessness, whatever it is. So this is cheap from an American point of view. The systems they're sending to Ukraine are systems that they've already they've already bought, so they're just using them up. Some of them are reaching obsolescence, so they were going to be replaced anyway. And the way the American system works, the pork barrel politics of it is that, because congressmen have these factories in their districts, every year the Americans have to produce X number of tanks or X number of armored vehicles, and most of them just sit in a storage depot. So from the American point of view, this is quite cost effective. For the Europeans, it's slightly different, but again, every European country is rich. Every European country can, if they want, find some way to get money. They're all well rated on the international markets. They can borrow money. They will be able to afford sustaining this problem, this conflict for as long as it takes. Britain is a slightly wobblier one because the United Kingdom is going through a significant period of dysfunction. So the military budget, while large, doesn't necessarily cater for the military, and even the 14 tanks or so we're sending off to Ukraine, it's a serious dent to our capability. But that doesn't change things from the Ukrainian perspective. Britain will continue to support Ukraine because everybody has made the clear calculation that it is much cheaper and it is much better to fight the Russians in Ukraine using Ukrainians than to fight the Russians in Paris or Berlin or in London using your own citizens, and also to suffer the level of destruction that the Ukrainians have suffered. The second point, though, is from the Russian point. How long could they afford this? So their economy has done quite well out of this, considering how much sanctions they're in, the problems. They've got a very good economic team, but they're kind of running on borrowed time. Energy prices have dropped and will continue dropping. Their biggest kind of customer, the EU, is never going to buy from them again. Not in the next, I don't think for this generation you'll get the amount of trade from the EU, direct trade from the EU. To sell to the EU, they have to go through India, China, use middlemen and all that kind of stuff. And that just takes a lot of money away from it because they've got to sell at a discount. So for the Russians, this is going to keep, the costs are going to keep adding up. And then you add to the cost of that, the amount of men who've been mobilized, the amount of men who've run away, the amount of equipment they've got to replace, and the fact that they don't have that many allies. China is not supporting them, in as strongly as it could. North Korea is a basket case in it for itself. Iran is just going to make money and, out of this. So Russia is in a fairly precarious situation, and it needs to end this war, I would suggest, this year, in one way or another. The West will most likely get weary, especially when it comes around the point of the US election. But I do not see them running out of will or money this year or the next. And just a final thing, just as I alluded to previously, when you see things like these tanks, Patriots, coming on system, as I said before, a lot of what you're seeing now has already been planned, factored in months and months ago. What you see now is just the theater around it, the whole dramatic, kind of piece that we need to sell to the public, that this is why we need to do it. I hate making predictions, but I will boldly make a prediction that, by the end of this year, before the end of this year, you will see advanced aircraft coming in. You'll see much longer range artillery, much longer range missiles coming in. All of that has already been priced in, has already been factored in. I wouldn't be surprised if you don't have people training already. And then come maybe, summer, autumn, you'll have some big political hoo-ha about whether we should send F-16s to Ukraine. There'll be a lot of talking about it. And then all of a sudden, magically, Ukraine will get F-16s. This war is not going to end this year or the next. It's a long
haul. I'm sure at least the Ukrainians will be looking forward to that prediction of yours coming true, because they're already asking for those aircraft at the very least. But Chidi, as always, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Very enlightening conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And after the break, Turkey says it is meaningless to restore NATO dialogue with Sweden and Finland. We'll have details in a moment. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu has said it is, quote, meaningless to hold a trilateral meeting with Sweden and Finland to discuss their NATO bids after protests this month in Stockholm. Speaking at a news conference, Mr. Cavusoglu also said there is no offer to evaluate Sweden and Finland's NATO membership separately. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson has said his country wants to restore NATO dialogue with Turkey after Ankara indefinitely postponed trilateral talks with both countries over their membership.
There will be no meaning to that meeting under the current circumstances. What is the aim of this trilateral mechanism? We put the agreement on the table and go through each article and check what did Finland and Sweden do about them. But as the current situation will shadow this process, we delayed the meeting as it won't be a healthy one. We did not receive an official offer to separate the membership process of Sweden and Finland. We always say that both countries need to take steps as part of their membership process. But both NATO and those countries are fond of the membership process.
to go hand-to-hand. As we did not receive such an offer, it won't be right to comment on whether we will evaluate it.
Poland's prime minister has thanked Germany for the decision to send tanks to Ukraine, saying pressure and diplomacy makes sense. During a news conference in Komarov, Mateusz Morawiecki said, quote, something that was not even possible a month ago became a reality. Yesterday, it shows that all the discussions, diplomacy, as well as, what can I say, pressure, makes sense. Germany said on Wednesday it will supply its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, overcoming misgivings about sending heavy weaponry that Kiev sees as crucial to defeat Russia's invasion, but Moscow casts as a desperate provocation. And the United States has imposed sanctions on a Chinese company for allegedly providing satellite imagery in Ukraine to help Russia's Wagner mercenary group. The U.S. Treasury Department and State Department announced a slew of actions as they formally designated the Wagner Group as a transnational criminal organization, a move previewed last week by the White House. The new sanctions will further impede the Kremlin's ability to arm its war machine that is engaged in a war of aggression against Ukraine, and which has caused unconscionable death as well as other things, according to Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Amongst the firms targeted was Changsha Tianyi Space Science and Technology Research Institute Company, a Chinese firm that the Treasury Department says has provided satellite imagery over Ukraine to the Wagner Group. And Hungary's foreign minister has asked the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council to begin negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. The minister said, quote, we urge the international community to replace the war rhetoric by peace rhetoric. I humbly ask the representatives of the so-called superpowers to sit around the negotiating table and negotiate about how peace could be created in our neighborhood. Mr. Shirato stressed the economic impact the war is having on his country, including an influx of migrants and elevated energy costs since the war began. The Swedish government has pledged almost $2 million, which is the equivalent of 20 million Swedish kroner, to the International Atomic Energy Agency to support its nuclear safety mission in Ukraine. According to the Swedish Minister for International Development, Cooperation and Foreign Trade, Johan Forssell, as a result of Russia's aggression, we have seen several attacks in the immediate vicinity of nuclear power plants over the past year, posing very significant risks. He added that strengthening the IAEA's important work to maintain and improve the safety of Ukrainian nuclear power plants is a matter of urgency. And when we return, Sabalenka beats Linnet to set up Australian Open final at Rybakina. That's in the sports news out of the conflict. Please join us again. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. And it's that time on the program when we take a look at the business of the conflict. And our business correspondent, Ini John McQuarrie, is here. Good morning. We've been talking about it all day. So it's not surprising that there's a boom in U.S. arms sales. We're talking about Abrams tanks. We're talking about Bradley fighting vehicles. So possibly it's not only the U.S., but for today we're focusing on the U.S. What do we know?
Yeah, so we know that for last year, the war started in February.
That's right.
What the U.S. had as transfers for arms, U.S. arms, was up, totaled about $52 billion. Meanwhile, in the first quarter of 2021, it was just about 34. So that's a whole lot. But I think the perspective I would like to bring is this. The U.S. has given a lot of aid to Ukraine. Yeah. The U.S. has given a lot of equipment and war tanks and all of that to Ukraine. And so the market, the arms market is booming, and they're also spending a lot of money. It would be nice to know, when you balance out where does it leave the United States?
Where the profit is.
Exactly.
If there is.
If there is. Because, yes, we see the numbers that the arms market and sales is booming because obviously the countries at war, they need to use arms, and individuals involved in the business are making more profits. But as a country, that's the United States now, when they give out so much, I think other than the UK, I think US is the biggest giver so far.
Yeah,
Every time
actually,
they're
by far, the US is the biggest.
Exactly. So it'd be nice to balance it out and see if really war is profitable, because we always say that. I mean, even though it's war, there's still some people making money out of it, making profit out of it.
My guest, or I guess just now, said that, look, no matter what happens, there will always be money found for war. If there is a war.
Yes, there'll always be money found. That's why Ukraine, IMF, and everybody there, they have aids and loans. And you know, they're even talking about how to get the seized assets of Russia, to get it for
Ukraine.
For Ukraine
to use it to reconstruct the country.
Exactly. And they're talking about the legality of it and how to get you know, man makes law. Law doesn't make man, you know, at the end of the day. But I mean, for the US, it would be nice to know if, when you look at the summary of it,
that's right,
if they are really making profits because of all the aids and all, while making money from the arms sales.
Well, one person, one country that is definitely making money, we don't need to talk about the summary or look at it.
Whether you look at it from the front or from the back.
They're making money is India.
India
and it looks like they're set to make even more money. Yes,
because from next month, the transfer of oil from the seaborne, you know, we know the pipe has come to an end and all of that. So from the sea is going to kick in. The sanction on that is going to kick in. So that would mean less Russian oil sold to the unfriendly countries, you know, because of sanctions. And more oil available for India. So now they're talking about, we know the price
already cap enjoy a special discount.
Yes, imagine getting it low. So price cap is at $60. They are buying about $35. So imagine even bringing it down. Meanwhile, oil prices in the global market is going up. It's about $80, $90. Guess what? India gets this cheap oil at $35 for now, maybe to go lower than that next month.
As time goes on,
exactly.
Yes.
They get it, they process it into petrol, diesel, whatever, and sell it in the international market.
Including to these unfriendly countries.
Exactly. Including to the West and to Europe, you know, at very high cost. Who's gaining?
They are, obviously. They are. That's why I said they're set to make a lot more money.
They're set to make a lot of money, you know. And so we're just talking about the U.S. and selling arms. This is a more profitable business.
Far more. And they're not directly involved. I don't know how much humanitarian aid or military aid they've given anybody.
I've not heard. I mean, you're on the program every day, so I guess you would know better.
I do. Now, speaking of that, the corollary of that, of course, is that a new energy hub, I mean, we're talking now on the other side, a new energy hub is to be created for Ukraine, but in Poland. Of course, Poland shares a border with Ukraine, so it makes sense, right?
Yes, because you know they've been really hit. Their power supply has been hit. We've heard it. You have discussed it with all of your guests here. We've seen the visuals. So this is another aid coming to the way of Ukraine, but obviously to avoid some of those destructions, since the war is not going on in Poland, you know, it's being set up in Poland to be able to supply energy to Ukraine. And this is also money. Well, when we hear of all of those aids that are coming their way, this is part of what is being used for, and perhaps to help. And you know, yesterday they had their MPC, you know, and they had to hold rates, but I mean, mostly it's just a country at war is just being highly managed at 25% for their rates. So because if there's no production and there's no supply of goods, commodities, food, there's no exports. That is what they live on, agriculture. And of course, we expect inflation to really go high up there.
Very high.
You know, and even when they have the interest rate at 25%, are people really going out there? Are we seeing businesses, manufacturers, going there to get the money?
Take loans and service them and all of that.
Exactly, because where are they going to do the production? Where are they doing it? If everywhere is a war, infrastructure is being scattered, no power. I think they've held up for a long time when the war started. They still had power. I see you talk to a lot of people there in Kyiv and, you know, all of that, and they still use internet and all of that. But now it seems that they're really getting
the attrition rate is increasing much more quickly, whichever way you look at it. And speaking of attrition rates, back in Russia, beef, the prices have gone up.
Yes.
What do we know about that?
Well, we know that Russia produces beef. They have a cattle market, even though their major focus is actually poultry. They do a lot of exports of poultry and all of that. But what has happened is, because it's cattle dairy, and it's mostly being done in communities and in, you know, their country homes.
Right.
Like, you know, but people are leaving, so you don't have a lot of production coming from that. They have more concentration on poultry, turkey, and all of that. But when it comes to beef, which they also export, even though I think it's about 19% before the war, about 19% of their export revenue used to come from beef. Yes, 40-something% comes from poultry. So they do a whole lot of that. But because of the devastation that has come with the war, yesterday when Kaede was here, we discussed how Turkey now has put a ban on giving permits, resident permits, to Russians, you know, because already they have about 153,000 that have moved there. We've talked about the one with UAE also.
That's right.
I mean, Poland and all of that.
That has impacted prices.
Of course.
When these people come, most of those who are moving are the more wealthy,
the big guys,
big guys, you know, so of course they put pressure on the prices.
Exactly. You know, so these are the people who are supposed to be doing those production, and they are leaving, running to other countries, trying to get safety and maybe their own way of saying they're not in support of the war. So that's it. The industry is feeling that impact, and so because supply has reduced, then of course prices just go up.
All kinds of things happening with this conflict in here.
Yes.
And,
it's not good for anybody at the end of the day.
Conflict is never good. Even if the people are making money, there's probably more being lost than is being gained.
I mean, if for nothing else, the lives involved, you can never buy that.
Back. Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much, Ini.
Ini,
of course, we'll have all the details of the other business news of the day from the non-conflict zones as well on Business Morning, along with her team and on BizInc. Thanks, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories still here. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's not interested in meeting his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin for peace talks. Asked whether the war in Ukraine could be resolved through a peace talk with the Russian president, Mr. Zelensky said, "It is not interesting for me, not interesting to meet, not interesting to speak." Mr. Zelensky said there were many more casualties on Russia's side than the Ukrainians, adding that in the east they're losing a large number of people, but they don't care. They're not counting people. We are counting their people. And Ukraine has threatened to boycott the 2024 Olympics in Paris, France, if Russian and Belarusian athletes are allowed to take part, a prospect described as unacceptable by the country's sports minister. Such a situation is unacceptable before our country, and that's according to Vadim Gutsuk, the Ukrainian foreign minister. And still staying with the sports, Australian Open organizers have issued a reminder to players and their entourages about their policy of inappropriate flags after a video emerged showing Novak Djokovic's father posing for pictures with fans holding Russian flags. 4 fans with inappropriate flags and symbols were questioned by Victoria Police following Wednesday's quarterfinal between Djokovic and Russia's Andrei Rublev. A video so posted on social media showed one supporter on the steps of Rod Laver Arena holding up a Russian flag with the image of President Vladimir Putin on it. Russian and Belarusian flags are banned from Melbourne Park during the tournament after a complaint from the Ukrainian ambassador to the country. Belarus is a key staging ground for Russia's war in Ukraine, which Moscow terms a special operation. Russian and Belarusian players were banned from Wimbledon last year, but are able to compete as individual athletes without national affiliation at Melbourne Park. And finally on the program, Aryna Sabalenka surged into the Australian Open final with a 7-6, 6-2 win over unseeded Paul Magdalene to extend the red-hot Belarusians' unbeaten start to the year and book a clash with Elena Rybakina. Adelaide champion Sabalenka has not dropped a set en route to 10 wins in 2023, but made a poor start in chilly conditions on the Rod Laver Arena, dropping her serve to love in the opening game before breaking back with 2 blistering backhands. Up next for Sabalenka will be Russian-born Kazakh Rybakina after the Wimbledon champion got past another Belarusian and 2-time Melbourne Park winner Victoria Azarenka 7-6, 6-3 in the first semi-final. That's our program. Thanks for being with us. Do have yourselves a pleasant day and weekend ahead. Good morning. My name is Ladi Akiri Duluali.